Hello everyone and welcome back to HS English. Today we'll be looking at the theme of animals within Of Mice and Men. So yeah, without further ado, let's go straight into it. So with the first paragraph, we're going to look at the character of Lenny and how the kind of animalistic features he's been described with. So initially you can see his description from Steinbeck by saying he's as strong as a bull, he drags his paws, he bleats like a lamb, all these kind of descriptive AO1 type knowledge things that you can use in your essay, just like as like the kind of evidence when it comes to your paragraphs. And he also kind of like further supports the animalistic description by telling George at the start how he can always go and live in a cave when George is increasingly frustrated by Lenny as he wants ketchup, for example, with his beans right at the start of the novel. And therefore, you can use this animalistic description of Lenny as your first paragraph when it comes to the theme of animals. But the animalistic description, it actually provides a sense of irony because it shows like a portrayal that Lenny ain't bright, another quote actually from the novel by George, and it shows that although Lenny is like the most physically powerful character, it's ironic that he's the weakest in terms of authority in a kind of mental sense, because Lenny seems to have slight mental problems and relies on George for a lot of things, and people like Lenny, in terms of the AFO historical context, would have been placed in a booby hatch or a psychiatric hospital, which is what the booby hatch means, sorry. Therefore, and that really because there wasn't much help at the time, and there was no kind of welfare due to the state of like the Great Depression. There was a lack of subsidies for people like Lenny. They had to rely on someone to survive, and this is why Lenny relies on George to survive. And even the kind of booby hatch stuff, as there was very little help. This guy's crux taunts how they tie you with a collar, indicating the kind of insecurities. And that kind of like survival of the fittest nature when it comes to Great Depression is every man for themselves. The whole reason why the friendship, for example, of George and Lenny is so, so against the stereotype of the Great Depression. Even the boss, for example, doesn't know, is thinking, has he asked George what your deal with like Lenny is, because he doesn't believe in a friendship as well. And yeah, continuing with paragraph 2, we're going to look at the actual animals that are shown in the shown in the novel, sorry, and that animals mostly have been portrayed for the sense of foreshadowing within the novel. For example, the first scene, a water snake manages to escape a heron, but at the end of the novel, of the novel, the heron catches the water snake, which almost foreshadows how Lenny has been able to escape Weed, but is eventually caught in Soledad. Remember, Weed was the place where Lenny and George came from, and they had to actually escape there because of Lenny's, after he pulled on her red dress to a woman, and they had to basically run out. And yeah, and eventually they've been caught in Soledad. That whole kind of aspect, again, of Robert Burns' gang after Agley. No matter how well we might plan for the future, things will often go wrong, because that's Robert Burns' poem. Is I think I have it somewhere actually in yeah, here we go. The best laid schemes of mice and men, gang after Agley. That's where the actual title of the novel comes from. And moving on with animals, you can see how Lenny loves to pet and stroke mice, but then he breaks the mouse by petting it too hard. Lenny then unintentionally kills the puppy, and then eventually kills Curly's wife. Therefore, when it comes to foreshadowing, you can see animals as almost building up to this moment when Lenny will kill Curly's wife. First the mice, then it becomes larger with the pup, then it becomes eventually Curly's wife. And similarly, Candy's dog, for example, in terms of foreshadowing, is killed by Carlson's Luger pistol, and Candy explains how he ought to have shot that dog himself. It almost foreshadows how George eventually will shoot Lenny in the back of the head with the same Luger pistol of Carlson, and also shows Candy that that is what happens to people like Candy once they're old, once they pass the kind of like prosperous date almost. Because there is very little help towards elderly people such as Candy until really the 1935 Social Security Act was the last kind of like was the first time you had certain like pension, for example. Hence, Candy's dog's killing because he's old is a fear, basically, a foreshadow of the fear that Candy has. What will he do? He's old. Hence, he wants to join the American dream of George and Lenny. And yep, again, the AFO, you can use the Social Security Act and everything I just said there of 1935. I can write that down actually right here just quickly. I'll just write that here just for you to know. Social Security Act of 1935. Already, Yep, security. Yep, and that is the basically act when the first type of pension came from. But this, of course, is like 6 years after the Great Depression had actually begun. So yeah, that's here. So paragraph 3 is when we look at Lenny, for example, working on his own version of the American Dream. Which, what was the American Dream? The historical context is that idea that every citizen, no matter their background, should have an equal opportunity to achieve success and prosperity through hard work and determination. But in terms of the animalistic sense theme, you look at Lenny's dream to tend the rabbits, the whole rabbit aspect, and to feed them in alfalfa, and Lenny actually threatens to break the necks of any goddamn cat that should threaten the lives of the future rabbits. And it's also, for example, a giant rabbit that springs out of his mind and scolds him as he plays with his consciousness after the death of, I believe, Curly's wife in the last scene. Therefore, similarly, this whole rabbit idea connected to Lenny is why when George is shooting Lenny, he makes him think of the rabbits, makes him think of that dream, and that's where George shoots Lenny and ensures that eventually Lenny will die happy with his, kind of thinking of the rabbits. And yeah, again, you can link from the title of Robert Burns' the title of the novel comes from Robert Burns' poem, and AF4 here is that from this poem, it's the line that says here, "The best laid schemes of mice and men gang aft agly. No matter how well we plan for the future, things often go wrong." And of course, it just reflects the failure of Lenny's American Dream, the failure to tend to the rabbits. Remember, this is the theme of animals, but again, you can bring this sense of an American Dream into this by looking at the theme of rabbits and how this kind of rabbits played into Lenny's mind, throughout the novel. So yeah, thank you very much. As you can see, we've got the next essay, the final theme hopefully planned for Mice and Men. So yeah, feel free to subscribe, and well, see you later. Thank you.